Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to dive right back into the wonderful world of everyone's favorite undead superhero with Spawn number 31. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in May of 1995, we can see here on the cover, a fantastic cover, I would like to add, image of Spawn being reflected in the faceplate of who is no longer being referred to as the anti-Spawn, because thankfully Todd McFarlane realized how dumb of a name that actually is. No, this character has now been renamed the Redeemer, thankfully, for all of our sake, because the Redeemer is a far better name and, actually creative instead of just being lackluster and unoriginal. I'm sorry, I really don't like characters who are anti the character they're fighting against or the reverse of the character they're fighting against. It just seems like a real lazy way of naming a villain who could otherwise have their own unique personality. And I'm just really happy that Todd McFarlane decided to, move away from that trend or trope and give the Redeemer a proper name. Story, Todd McFarlane. Art, Greg Capullo, Todd McFarlane. Copy editor and letters, Tom Orzechowski. Color, Steve Oliff and Ollie Optics. Our story begins with Spawn sitting in the darkness inside of a boxcar riding a train on his way back to New York City, as he, I guess, finally realized that trying to walk from Alabama to New York City was a terrible idea, and it would be much more sensical for him to just hitch a ride on a train. However, as he sits in the darkness brooding, he does still fixate and obsess on the meeting that he had with Wanda, his former wife, and how she was fearful of him and rejected him and ran away from his presence. Of course, Wanda also has no idea that Spawn is in fact her late husband, Al Simmons, but it seems like she would probably not react well to that information if she had it. I mean, the idea that her husband is resurrected as what she considers to be an unforgiving monster who just kills people that, he sees as evil and whatnot. Granted, those men were attacking Wanda that he killed, but she was terrified by the callousness with which Spawn, just ended all their lives. So she's really struggling, to deal with just having witnessed that level of violence. And then to throw on top of it, they're like, oh, by the way, this is your husband who's been dead for the last 5 years, would have probably been a tough pill to swallow. As the train pulls into the station and comes to a stop, we see that Spawn was not the only man inside of that boxcar. It was also filled with at least a dozen other homeless men who are all looking to begin anew in New York City, hoping that they can somehow turn their lives around. Spawn exits the train and looks up at the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, realizing that he's home, and he actually feels good to be home. Also, in 1995, these two buildings were still there, obviously. This is before the September 11th attack that destroyed both of them. Spawn then wastes no time in trying to get back to his alleys as he quickly sprints across the rooftops of New York City, making his way back to his lair. As he slowly creeps through the shadows, he sees two familiar faces in Bobby and Bootsy as they stand before the throne that the men of the alleyways made for Spawn, and Bootsy is looking up at his boots that he left on the throne. The two of these men believe that Spawn is probably never going to return, and Bootsy left his prized boots on Spawn's throne as, I guess, a way of just trying to honor him and being like, he was a good guy, he was my friend, and I really miss him. And I'm going to leave this up here as a tribute. But he also really misses these boots, too. And Bobby's like, come on, man, they're just boots. Like, do we have to come here, every day and do this? Bootsy tells Bobby that, it's just hard for him as, he misses his friend. And he also misses wearing his boots that he's been wearing for the last 20 years. And despite living on the streets, has gone to great lengths to keep in good condition. Bobby, however, tells him, hey, man, I understand, you've had them for a long time, but they are just boots. And, I miss Al too. He was my friend as well. And I wish we could see him once again, but he may never be coming back. when suddenly Spawn jumps out from behind the throne with Bootsy's boots on his hands and screams boo. This, of course, scares the living crap out of the two of them, but then they're suddenly overcome with joy as they realize that their friend has returned. They state that, man, we never thought we'd see you again. And Spawn says, oh, I can't stay away too long from you guys. I'd miss you too much. And it's kind of crazy because this is actually one of the first times we ever see Spawn being portrayed as like legitimately jovial. We've seen him lighten up in times where he had been drunk in the alleyways with the men. But, this time he's literally just happy to see two guys that he considers his buddies. And he was, literally just screwing around with them, having some fun. And, it's one of the rare instances where we see Spawn being more humanized. Bootsy is also overjoyed at the fact that he can take his boots off of Spawn's throne and put them back on, which he's really happy about. Meanwhile, in another part of the city that is apparently not in night, but in daylight, which is kind of weird, as we saw Spawn travel to the alleyways in darkness, and it's now suddenly daylight and supposed to be at roughly the exact same time. We see the building that the angels are running their Terran affairs out of, as we see the angel who is now in charge of these affairs, Raphael, who replaced Gabriel after Gabriel was essentially arrested and I guess charged. That's a little bit sketchy in terms of how angel law works, because of her dereliction of duties and also because of her betrayal and attempt to set up Angela for crimes she did not commit. Of course, that entire storyline takes place in the Angela miniseries. If you'd like to know more about that and watch my videos on that miniseries, you can check them out in my Spawn miniseries playlist. Raphael contacts the orbital space station, in which two of the angels of heaven have possessed some astronauts and are now monitoring the Earth around the world, looking for any activity from Hellborn or creatures who have Hell aura. And also, that's where we saw them create the costume for the former anti-Spawn and now the current Redeemer, as we don't know if it's exactly a symbiote the same way that Spawn's costume is, but it acts somewhat similarly. Raphael asks for an update, and they report to her that they've actually recorded 3 beings who have Hell aura. There's obviously Spawn, who is just oozing with it, but there's also 2 other beings that have very faint traces of it, one of which being Bobby, as he was resurrected by Spawn after being killed by Chapel. And my guess is that the other one is Cagliostro, but they don't name him, and they're not too certain about who that being is or what he's doing in New York. But Raphael is happy that they've figured this out and that they're in her own backyard and that she can now go after them and basically prove that she's more than up to the task of running Terran affairs and can do a much better job than the former administrator, Gabriel. As we're then teleported to the orbital space station, Raphael asks the angels on the station if they believe that one of the individuals may have been the result of a power transfer, that meaning that Spawn actually gave some of his energy to someone else. We, of course, know that this, in fact, was the case. However, the forces of heaven do not. The angels state that it's inconclusive, but there is the possibility. Raphael is actually quite intrigued, as it's always been speculated by the forces of heaven that this was possible, but it's never been documented. She then asks if they've chosen a new vassal for the anti-Spawn, aka Redeemer costume. They state that they have, in fact, as they have decided that Jason Wynn was actually a poor choice, as while he was calibrated correctly for the costume, he himself was not really compatible with it, as he was not really someone who was interested in serving the cause or the forces of heaven. And they believe that if they choose someone who is already a devout believer, that that person will actually be far more powerful and far more better equipped to deal with fighting a Hellspawn. Raphael agrees that a soldier with a good soul would be a perfect choice, and they decide that they've got their next person in mind, and all they need to do is zap them up to the space station the same way they did Jason Wynn. Meanwhile, at the CIA building that Terry Fitzgerald is currently working at, he's working diligently to try and hack into the files of Jason Wynn. He's trying to figure out exactly why Jason Wynn came after him and why he was betrayed by the agency, and what exactly is behind all of these motivations to send literally everyone and their brother after him. However, he's not finding any success in his attempts to hack into the system, and even goes so far as to try to use international channels that also don't work. And it's at this point he realizes that if Wynn's gone to this much trouble to prevent his files from being accessed by anyone, that the only possibility that he'll ever have of trying to break into Wynn's files is to transfer directly into Wynn's department, which, as we can probably guess, is going to be really dangerous for Terry going forward, as Wynn really has an axe to grind with Terry, and Terry is not necessarily equipped to go toe-to-toe against Jason Wynn and all of the resources that he has at his disposal. Meanwhile, back in the alleyways, Bobby and Bootsy begin to catch Spawn up as to what has been going on since he's been gone, telling him that many of the men who live in the alleys have kind of decided they don't want Spawn there, as they believe that he's causing too much trouble in their lives, which is honestly kind of a fair assessment. It's not like there were, cyborg hitmen and demons showing up to the alleys before Spawn got there. But Bobby assures him that he and Bootsy are not two of those men, and that they consider Spawn to be a good friend of theirs, and they don't want him gone at all. But Bobby then does ask, why did you split without saying anything? To which Spawn responds, I didn't have a choice. I was hijacked by two angels who took me to heaven, and then I was dropped off in the deep south and had to work my way back here. It's just taken me this long to do so. But he does state that his time away let him know that, he's not the only one whose life is being, manipulated by forces he can't control and feels super, crazy. He realizes that angels have to deal with conflict, children, and that some go out of their way to commit violence and create conflict as much as they can, as we saw in the previous issue. He then asks the two men what happened to Curse, as he points to the spot where Curse was once hanging on the wall. And they state they don't know, that he suddenly just disappeared, and in a hurry, as he didn't even take all the parts of his arm along with him. It's at this point, though, that Bootsy realizes that Spawn's cape is looking pretty bad and asks him what's going on. Spawn tells him of what happened in the battle that he took place in heaven, and how his cape saved him and Angela, but was also basically destroyed in the process, and that his costume really hasn't been the same ever since, and he's kind of hoping that it manages to get back under control instead of going, more outlandish and wild and kind of crazy the way it's been the past few weeks, because he's kind of worried about what's going to happen if his costume can't recuperate. Meanwhile, in another part of the city at the 21st Street Mission, we are introduced to a man by the name of Phil Timper. Phil was formerly a criminal on a really bad life path that eventually led him to serving time in prison for grand theft. But while in prison, he actually found God and decided to turn his life around. And for the past 7 years, he's been a model citizen, volunteering at soup kitchens, trying to help the homeless, and really just be kind of the most upstanding guy he can be, when he's suddenly hit by the same giant lightning bolt that we saw hit Jason Wynn, and he disappears. He then immediately reappears on the orbital space station, where he's engulfed in the holy fire and is screaming in agony due to the immense amount of pain he's in. However, the two angels are actually impressed by how high his pain tolerance is by comparison of that, which Jason Wynn had, and they state that he's actually going to be a much better vessel for the Redeemer than Wynn was. They state that, he's going to be superior in all ways and is going to be much more compatible with the suit. And the only thing needed to complete the process of the transmutation is nuclear diffusion, where we see his body simply being ripped apart and disintegrated as he looks shocked and in pure agony. And this is where it's kind of weird that, for whatever reason, Mabolja waits to get condemned souls to use for Hellspawn creation, whereas the forces of heaven just seem to grab living human beings off the face of the planet in broad daylight with no regard as to who sees it, and not even trying to hide any of what they're doing, which there's really no reason for them to, but it just seems odd that they're not using any of, the deceased individuals that are going up to heaven for this process. They're just grabbing live people. We then get a page of the news reports. Todd's still using the CNN and E trademarked logos when he did not have permission to do so. They're all talking about the disappearance of Phil Tippmann, this is where it kind of gets a little less believable in some aspects. Like, it makes sense for CNN to cover a story like this, but E Entertainment Television, being one of the, trusted news sources and reporting on news that's happening, on a local level and not on like a national or international level, kind of doesn't make a ton of sense given the type of network that E is and was at this time. And then, of course, our old pal Thurston Burns down here at the bottom, who is more or less just chastising the police for not doing a better job of investigating Tippmann's disappearance, as he was at one point even given an award by the previous mayor for being such an outstanding citizen and all of his charity work. Of course, he states that, now that mayor's lost his re-election bid, he doesn't care about Phil or anyone else, and that, he can just go rot for all he cares. And to some degree, maybe Thurston's right, but this just goes right along with his firebrand personality. Meanwhile, in the police gymnasium, we see Twitch rather shocked and impressed by the considerable amount of weight that our old pal Sam has put on. In fact, stating, man, I've never seen a scale go that high before. Sam says, yeah, pretty impressive, huh? And Twitch is a little shocked and is like, hey, you don't seem bothered by this, and you seem in an unusually good mood. Is there a reason for that? And Sam says, yeah, I think old Chief Banks is going to be getting a little letter soon that's going to brighten up my day. Back at the police department headquarters, we see Banks open up a letter that says, roses are red, violets are blue. Now that Kincaid is gone, the trail leads back to you. This poem stinks, but, let's be honest. It's probably safe to assume that Sam's not the greatest writer. And Banks realizes immediately that there's somebody out there who knows exactly what happened between him and Kincaid. So he immediately wastes no time in calling Wynn's office and getting Jason on the phone so that the two of them can deal with this immediate problem. Later on in the evening, back in the alleyways around 4 a.m., Spawn wanders through the darkness, happy to see that all of the men of the alleys are sleeping peacefully now that their quote-unquote king has returned. However, his costume suddenly starts to react violently to something that it finds very wrong. Spawn knows to listen to his costume's instincts at this point, and he follows the direction that his chains are leading him, sprinting 3 blocks until he rounds a corner and sees a familiar sight that he was hoping he would never encounter again, as he looks upon what he still believes is the anti-Spawn standing over his friend Bobby, who is now being enveloped by some sort of holy light energy as Bobby screams in terror, stating, what are you doing? I'm not Spawn. But the Redeemer states, yes, I'm aware of this. However, you have been endowed with some of Spawn's energy, and this is a phenomenon we've never observed before. That makes you important to us, and we need to study you to find out what happened, or how this happened, and what it means for us. As he contacts the orbital station and preps him and Bobby for being teleported back up onto the station. Realizing that his friend is in immediate danger, Spawn quickly interjects himself, telling the Redeemer to back away and telling him, this is between you and me, Anti-Spawn. At this point, Redeemer states, no, the name is Redeemer. Also, I'd like to point out, I really like the fact that Greg took the time to give the Redeemer a unique speech bubble quality like what Spawn has, by having a little cross be what connects the speech bubble to his mouth. I think that's like a cool little stylistic choice. Spawn then leaps through the air to try and do battle with the Redeemer. However, Redeemer tells him, my mission is with this subject, not with you, so leave. He then immediately backhands Spawn and knocks him back and says, your time will come later. Spawn once again leaps towards the Redeemer, trying to get him away from Bobby as he continues to basically infuse Bobby with what I can only assume is like the holy fire that courses through his own body. Once again, Redeemer knocks him back with a single blow, stating, listen to your costume. It's weak and so are you. You're in no position to fight me and you pose no actual threat. Spawn tries again in vain to save his friend as the Redeemer continues to pummel him with very little effort, knocking him back into the wall with a single punch. And we realize that Spawn has still not fully regained his strength after the events of the Angela miniseries and him being in heaven. And he really is no match for the Redeemer at this point. And he really struggled in his fight against the anti-Spawn when it was Jason Wynn, just barely surviving that encounter. So things are looking pretty grim for him this time around, as he seems to be completely outclassed in every conceivable way. Spawn, now realizing that he's not going to be able to go toe-to-toe with the Redeemer, decides on a different tactic of deception as he leaps forward once again in another attack, leaving himself open for a blast of holy fire energy that bursts right through the back of his torso. However, Spawn planned on that happening, and the hole in his torso was actually already there, as he never actually healed from the battle that he had with the curse, and has left this hole in his torso the entire time. It was just covered up by the costume. Unfortunately, his plan ultimately fails as we see Redeemer teleport off the earth with Bobby, and Spawn never considered that that could potentially happen. At this point, the men from the alleyway have all awakened and run to the commotion as they round the corner and see Spawn with a giant hole in his chest, fearing the worst, but Spawn lets them know, no, it's okay. This is a hole left by my battle with the curse. I never healed it on purpose. And, I was just kind of trying to play possum and hope that the Redeemer would think I was down for the count and give me an opening. However, before he can continue this explanation, his costume suddenly lashes out and whips one of the men across the face. At this point, Spawn realizes that his costume is reacting violently after being attacked by holy energy, and now can no longer distinguish friend from foe, as he screams for all the men to run before his costume kills them, as we see the cape and chains going wild and all the men running for their lives trying to dodge the wrath of the costume. As the costume finally settles down after a few hours of thrashing about in the alleyways, everything goes silent as Spawn loses consciousness and his costume finally just falls to the ground, as we see his power level is now at 6,971. And a few hours later, the costume starts to stir and things start to happen as it begins to move and to grow and to breathe, as we see spikes starting to jut and the cape starting to grow and Spawn reach up towards the sky with things forming on his hands, skulls starting to glow, and his eyes suddenly pop open as a metamorphosis is taking place. On the final page of the story, we see Spawn get to his feet, still in the shadows, but his silhouette has changed quite significantly, as we see a lot more things going on with his costume, and the cape has now been rejuvenated. And we're basically now officially in the start of what I refer to as the Capullo era of Spawn, as we see that the next issue is called A New Look. And on the next page, of course, we're back into our old friend Image Info, which is just blurbs about upcoming Image books and what's going on with Image Comics. Nothing really special to see here. We then reach the spawning grounds, of course, the letter section in which fans can write in letters and have them potentially be responded to by Todd McFarlane. Several letters in this month's issue have mixed feelings about issue number 29 of Spawn, which had pretty graphic depictions of child abuse and domestic violence in them. And, a lot of people, I guess, weren't prepared for having to deal with that heavy of a story in a comic book. And it's a pretty heavy and dark issue. If you haven't watched my video on issue number 29, you can find it in my Spawn playlist. I suggest you do if you want to know more about what's being talked about here. But some people really praise Todd for trying to shed a light on these kinds of things happening in the world, while other people are a little bit more critical of the way that the book ended and how it ended with the boy's father being killed. And it's understandable that there would be people on both sides of the fence, and, certain people wondering if Todd was doing a disservice by potentially glorifying an act of murder to escape violence and that kind of thing. It's an interesting debate. There's also another reader who writes in stating that, he doesn't really like the character of Spawn. He believes that Al Simmons is not some sort of a tragic hero, but is actually just kind of a self-absorbed narcissist, and that, he doesn't really feel like he should be rooting for Spawn, and that Spawn is, really the good guy in this case. And Todd's response is actually pretty cool, as Todd tells him, yeah, you're right. That's exactly the way I've been writing the story up until this point, and I do plan on evolving the character eventually, and if you hold on, you're going to see that evolution happen. But up until now, I haven't written it so that, Spawn, aka Al Simmons, is just this benevolent, tragic hero who had all these terrible things happen to him, and now he's just trying to find his way to some semblance of normality or trying to do good. He is responsible for the predicament that he's currently in, and he's not doing what needs to be done to make that predicament better. And of course, there's still people complaining about the way that the toy line stuff is being done, complaining about resellers, complaining about pricing. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that back in the 90s, people weren't quite as smart as to the way that the toy business worked. They didn't realize that retailers set their own prices. That's not, something that Todd really had any control over. And also that, he had no control over what resellers were doing either. And we still see that problem today, magnified even more by like eBay and other sites along those lines, where, you'll see someone manage to use a bot to get their hands on 50 pairs of sneakers or 20 PS2s and resell them at 10 times markup. This sort of thing was happening in the 90s to a much lesser and more localized extent, and people didn't like it back then either. But unfortunately, it seems like it hasn't totally changed here, 30 years later. We then get 2 pages of pinups, one by Kevin Conrad, this one's really cool, and one by Tony Daniel, that one's pretty cool as well. I gotta say, I really like both of these, and I'm glad that Todd chose to feature both of them in this issue. We then get to 2 pages of Image fan art, which is now in full color. What do you know? How about that? Todd throwing out the money to go ahead and print up full color illustrations that people have submitted, kind of showing that at this point he's starting to do a little bit better with Spawn and making some more money and can afford to do this. But again, pretty cool that people can now send in color Image fan art and are getting it printed in full color. I say now, in 1995 now. But, this is definitely a stark turn from the solely black and white Image fan art that we've been seeing up until this point. We then see an advertisement for the Spawn trade paperback, which will include the first 5 issues of Spawn. Though I am surprised that this wasn't being released until 1995. I mean, this is issue number 31 that this is being advertised in. Whereas, most of the other Image books were releasing trade papers immediately. Todd really kind of waited for a while to start doing that, which, again, kind of shocking. We then see an advertisement for the Spawn miniseries Blood Feud. I do have every issue of Blood Feud and will be making videos on Blood Feud in the future, but as of the recording of this video, I have not done so yet. We then see an advertisement for the Violator vs. Bad Rock miniseries. Again, as of recording this video, I have not made any videos about the Violator Bad Rock miniseries, but I will be as I have all the issues of it. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for White Zombie's Astro Creep 2000 and the tour to go with it. Awesome. Like, this was an album that was like a big part of my teenage years, and I still listen to this album to this day, man. It's a great album. If you like White Zombie, if you don't, you'd probably hate it. And, despite the fact that Rob Zombie is now almost 60 years old as I'm recording this video, you'd never know it watching the guy perform. I watched a video of one of his concerts probably about a week ago, just happened to come up in my algorithm. And this dude is jumping and running all over the stage at literally almost 60. You would never guess that this guy is a senior citizen with an AARP card and just bouncing all over the stage like he's 22 years old. I can't believe the kind of shape that Rob Zombie's still in at that age. And that was Spawn number 31. Overall, I think it's a great issue. The cover's fantastic. The story makes perfect sense. Great artwork inside. And very importantly, this is the first appearance of the Capullo costume for Spawn. And, well, in the story, we've seen it in ads before this. And, you know, I gotta say, I feel like Todd McFarlane took a big swing with this. You know, at this point, Spawn's only a 3-year-old title, and he's already allowing a new artist to come in and make a really significant change to the way that Spawn's costume looks. And that was a huge risk. You know, if costumes get changed for superheroes in any significant way, it can really divide a fan base. And for Todd to just be like, yeah, we're going to do this 3 years in is basically unheard of and pretty shocking to do. And ultimately it worked out. I mean, despite the fact that, you know, this is a Todd McFarlane creation and the look of Spawn was created wholly by Todd McFarlane, the look that's generally associated with Spawn in this day and age is almost always the Capullo costume. Like, that is basically regarded as Spawn's physical appearance as just like the default. And it's kind of shocking that, you know, someone else's vision of your character would be what people just associate as the character's look instead of your original vision. And honestly, I don't think it bothers Todd at all. You know, him and Greg are pretty good friends still to this day. And, you know, if he didn't trust Greg to take the character's look to a new height, I don't think he would have ever let him change the costume to begin with, which really just speaks to the level of trust that he had for Greg and Greg's artistic abilities to make such a substantial change to, you know, basically Todd's baby, man. I mean, you know, he left Marvel Comics to pursue his own independent career based around this character. And to just be like, here's the keys to a brand new artist 3 years in is just shocking. And, you know, again, I think it worked out for the best. I'm glad that he did it. I think we're all better off for it, including Todd. And it really just kind of shows how differently Todd was approaching, you know, comic books as the owner and proprietor of his business versus an employee. But then again, these are just my opinions. Your opinions may be different. You may not like this story. You may not like the name change from, you know, Anti-Spawn to Redeemer. You might not like the fact that Todd gave up on his original look for Spawn and let Greg change it completely around. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.